Hey, welcome back guys. Good to have you here. Welcome to Introduction to JavaScript course. Who am I? I'm Kaustubh, but you can call me KG. I will be teaching you session 4 of Introduction to JavaScript today. Before we begin, let's look at the session outline. In this session, we will be exploring Document Object Model. DOM, as it's short for Document Object Model, is a tree structure representation of HTML. It defines the logical structure of the HTML document and the way we can access and manipulate the elements on this tree structure using JavaScript. Again, as a reminder, if you have not taken HTML and CSS courses before, I'm going to strongly encourage you to take them, because from this session onwards, we will be focusing on DOM and we will be covering them in each of the projects that we'll be working on. In the last session, we covered the conditional statements and loops. We will be using many of these concepts in the projects that we will be working on together. But to work on these projects, we also need to learn how HTML can be accessed and manipulated using JavaScript. So let's begin. So what is DOM? So this is a typical W3C definition that we get for what DOM is. But to explain it simply, DOM is a way we can access the elements on the HTML page. Think of this in terms of visual information tree structure. So what do I mean by that? Let me show you. So this is your typical HTML file. You have the HTML element, the header element, body element, as well as the paragraph element here. And this is represented in a tree structure format. And the way we can access each one of these elements is by using JavaScript. And to access each one of these elements, we have to first access the overall element in which each individual element resides. So that overall object is called document object. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. So a document object model is a standard for how we can get, change, add, or delete the HTML elements. Now once we get these HTML elements, we can make changes to their property, we can add attributes to them, we can also access a few methods on these HTML elements, and we can also listen to key events on these elements and make sure that we add a bit of functionality to our HTML document. So DOM methods. These are the two most important DOM methods that we'll be looking at. So the first one is get element by ID. It is the most common one that you will be working on throughout this course. It is used to get the element by using the ID. So let's say if you have a paragraph element that is odd to your HTML file and you need to access this, if that element has an attribute of ID, we can access that using JavaScript. In a similar fashion, if we want to get more than one elements, we can use class names, because ID is unique. Remember, you must have learned this in the HTML course. ID is unique, but the class names can be reused again and again. So if you were to access multiple elements, we can use one single class name. So finding the HTML elements. Now imagine if you have 1,000 lines of HTML code and a couple of hundred div tags. If we were to access a particular div tag, how would we do it? For this, there are a few methods that are provided to us which make accessing this specific div tag easier. The easiest way to access a particular div tag is by accessing its ID or class name. When writing in HTML, we usually add an ID or class for that specific element. By using the methods available on the DOM object, we can access these elements by using IDs. So let us go back to Visual Studio Code Editor and we'll see this in action. So I'm going to create a new folder here, and I'm going to call this session 4, and I'm going to open up this folder in my Visual Studio Code. Let me create a new file called index.html. Let me close this up, and in here I will add a boilerplate code. Alright, so we already have the doc type, the HTML tag, the header, the body. Now we have to add a few div elements of our own. So let's add a few div elements. So this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. So for first, let's give it an ID of, let's say, container. For the second one, let's give a class of test. And for the second one, let's give an ID of, let's say, test2 and a class of test. Okay, now let's write some JavaScript to access these elements. Now the way we can do this is by adding a script tag. So let me add a script tag right below this. Okay, in here what I will do is I will use document dot get element by ID, and we'll access the first element and say container, and I want to see if I get this. So what I will do is I will store this in a variable. Do you remember the concept of variable that we learned in previous sessions? So I will say variable, give it a space. I'm accessing div1, so let's say div1 equal to, and I will assign document.getElementById by ID and container, and I will make sure I log this out. So I will say div1. So let us run this. So I'm going to open up a local host of 5500. Okay, it started at 5501, so let me begin at 5501, and let me go to inspect, and I already have an error, but it's fine. That's a favicon ICO error. But if you look at here, we have a div with an ID of container, and that's from index.html at line 21. So this is the log that has been printed. Okay, so let's say if I wanted to get all the divs with class of test, how would I do that? Let me first create a variable and say divs, and I will access the document and use the get elements by class name, and I will pass in the class name. Let me go back and log this out first, and I will say divs. Now if I open up the console, I should get two console.logs because I have two console.logs. First one is of course the get element by ID, and the second one was get elements by class name. If you notice, if you notice, we have two elements with the same class name. That's why we get two elements in the log. So we have two elements. We have element 1 and we have element 2. So that's great. Let's go back to our PowerPoint slides. Same way, once we get the access to the element, we can change the HTML attributes for it. So one of the way we can add new HTML elements is we can say element.innerHTML, or we can add a new attribute by saying element.attribute and a new value. If we were to change the styles available on this particular element, we can also add new styles by using element.style.property and define our styles. Alright, similar to the properties and the attributes on the elements, we can also have access to the events that these elements are attached to, and based on the trigger of these events, we can make changes to the index.html file. So let's look at a few of these events. So here are a few examples of these events. So one of the most common events is the user click. So when you're browsing on the web page, you click on different aspects of the HTML document, like for example a button. That is an event that is being registered, and based on that event we make decision on how to present changes onto the HTML file. One of the other event is to notice when the complete web page has loaded. One of the event is to see if the image has been loaded, and the rest are the few elements that you can see right from the point number 4 to point number 6, where you can see if the mouse is moving, mouse as in the cursor that is hovering over different elements. We can make sure that the element changes color when the mouse is hovering over it. We can also have the input field changed, right? So if you have noticed this, when you're filling out a form, when you click on an input element, you get a blue colored border for that specific element. That is by triggering of the event of bringing that element to focus. Right? So these are certain events that we will be talking about and discussing in this session, as well as most importantly in the projects that we'll be covering. So these are the key event listeners that we add to the HTML element. So one of them is on click, one is on load, one is on change, one is mouse over, and one is mouse down. These are just a few of them. There are a lot of events that you can attach to an element. I have not covered all of them, but I highly recommend you check few resources that I have provided at the end of this session. So let's actually code this and see how this will look. So let's go back to the Visual Studio Code Editor. Before I do anything, let me add a button element here real quick. I will say click me, and let me add an ID of click button. Okay, now let me go back inside the JavaScript. Let me create a variable to store this button. I will say document dot get element by ID, and we have click button. I believe the B of the button is capital. Now let me add a add event listener method to this element. So I will say button dot add event listener, and the event that we are listening for is click. Okay, once you register click, you want to run a function. So let me write a function name. I haven't defined this function yet, but let's say click button function. Now let me define this click button. So I'll say click button, and inside here I will add a console.log, and say button is clicked. Save it and see if this works. Looks like the application is already running. So let me go back here. Let me open this up at port 5501 and go to developer tools, to the console, and when we click on this button, it says button is clicked, so it looks like the event is being registered. Okay, so that's great. Now if we want to just register the event itself, what we can do is we can log the event out. So let's remove that button is clicked and add an event. Let's pass in E for event, and see how this looks. So let me click on this again, and you can see the entire event is being logged. So expand this, you get all the properties for this event. Now imagine the possibilities of what you can do with this event. We will be covering this in more detail in project 3, but till then, make sure you understand the events and how they are attached to the elements and how we can use JavaScript to manipulate them. Great, so let's go back to the slides. Alright, I believe this concludes the session, but before we do that, let's do a quick recap of what we have learned thus far. So we covered the document object model. Do you remember what a document object model is? In the simplest terms, document object model is a way we can access the elements on the HTML page. You remember the tree structure that we saw? Just imagine that whenever you're trying to code using document object model and JavaScript. We have learned the way we can access each of the elements that are in the document object model is by using certain methods that the DOM object provides. So do you remember some of these DOM methods? One of it is getElementsById, another one is getElementsByClassName, and there are a few more that you may encounter from time to time. I strongly encourage you look at a few resources that I provide at the end of this chapter. So having said that, let's move forward. Okay, in the next session we'll be starting with projects. So the first project that we will be building is a simple calculator using HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Full disclaimer, I will not be covering HTML and CSS in detail. I will be focusing on JavaScript mostly for all of the future sessions. So this concludes this session. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next session. Take care.